Go. All right, so tonight we are going to talk about Drupal render arrays. This is a discussion that we had internally at Rapid Development Group at our retreat this past month. I've updated some of the examples, and since then, as I've tried to answer questions and make things a little clearer, but I'm hoping that from our walking through this today and talking about things will make this even better. And I'm hoping to come up with some nice written articles summarizing this as an outcome. But first I have to know the topic well enough to talk about it before I can write it down. So today we are going to talk through, first off, what render arrays are, why you use them, and then we're going to go through examples of increasing complexity of how they're structured, how you can figure out what's available to use and make your own elements and things like that. We won't cover all of the things that a render array can do because it is too broad of a topic, but hopefully we will demystify some things in the process. So to begin with, what is a render array? To answer this, I think the best thing to do is talk through a little bit of the history of how Drupal grew up. All traditional content management systems basically are ways of producing HTML fundamentally. And the obvious way to produce HTML, since it's just text, is to start making a text string and start concatenating things onto the end of it until you have the full HTML you want to produce and print it all, or maybe you print it as you go. Actually, that's kind of the old WordPress model of just having PHP print things directly out to the browser as you go. So Drupal used to build up big strings of HTML and then flush them all out to the browser at the end, which does the job. The problem with this, there are a few problems with this. One is that the code can be a little hard to read since the structure of the HTML doesn't necessarily match the structure of putting it together. Since HTML is really a nested structure, but when you're making a text string, it's just linear. It's one long thing, so it's easy to have mismatched tags and stuff like that that crop in. So it's a little fragile. The other big weakness of that approach is that once you have done some work and created some HTML, it's hard to change it after the fact. And you would want to change it after the fact because a CMS is a huge system with lots of things interacting. And if you install a module from a third party, that module wants to be able to make changes to the output of other modules. And if everything is just a string of text, that becomes search and replace, and it's really easy to break stuff. So enter render arrays. The concept of a render array comes from the form API in Drupal, was it 6 that introduced the form API, I think? That was the concept of, instead of producing the markup for a form, you're going to describe the form as an array, describe all the properties of each element, and then be able to use that structure not just to render the HTML for the form, but also to process it and validate it, and deal with the results. So that has been extended in Drupal now, especially in 8 and 9, such that pretty much all output works that way. And that is what a render array is. It's kind of a generalization of the form API. So today we're going to talk about the render array system, the Drupal render system, and not specifically the form system, which is a special case, but it's really a larger topic because that does a whole lot more. And maybe we'll cover that on a later session. Okay, so that is what a render array is. So now let's take a look at one. When you have a simple page, you use a controller class and you have a callback function that has to return something. That can return objects of various types. If you want to return a response that is JSON or something like that, there are classes that deal with those. But the most common case is that you're going to return a render array. This is also what you'd return from a block class, for example, and many other places in Drupal. There are functions that expect to return a render array. And what is a render array? Well, it is an array, first off, and it contains one or more key value pairs, just like any other associative array in PHP. And the keys, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but often begin with this hash symbol. And there are a few special keys that are going to be, you're going to need to have at least one of these. One of the options, and the simplest one we can have, is a key called markup with a value that is HTML markup. That is the simplest thing you can do. And what this will produce is a page like this. I'm going to make this bigger. That simply has the HTML that we provided showing up here. So this is basically taking the previous concept of putting together a big string of HTML and shoving it into a render array. So the first thing that we should say is don't do this, except for pretty rare cases. This markup is an easy way to prototype something, but not something you want to see in any finished code, really. The reason for that is where you have exactly the same weaknesses we had before, in that you can't do much to manipulate this text later. So there are some other options we have besides markup. We can use plain text instead of markup. This is actually more useful than markup. What it does is escapes everything that you give it and prints out the result. So why is this more useful? Because this is a safe way to handle user input, for one thing. If you've got content that you don't trust and you want to display it, plain text will make sure that you won't have any broken markup of an open tag without a closed tag, but also you don't have any possibility of any cross-site scripting attacks. I guess on that note, the hash markup option also goes through some cross-site scripting filters. So it isn't necessarily echoing everything that you give it. exactly. It'll strip out some stuff, but this is super safe because it's escaping everything. So we've got markup and we've got plain text. We also have an important thing, and the thing that we're going to be talking about the most, type. Type lets you tell the render system that this element in the array is a particular kind of thing that's going to be defined in a class somewhere, and it can have corresponding properties. And so there is an HTML tag class. I could find it actually by just searching for it here. Okay, so there is a class in the Drupal core render element here that is called HTML tag, and it knows how to deal with anything of this structure with that type. And there's a whole bunch of code that it knows how to handle some properties you can give it. So what this particular one is doing is it's saying, I'm going to print out an HTML tag. The type of the tag is a paragraph, and the value is this string here. And so if I look at that, this is very similar to the first one that we looked at. And if we inspect that, we can see that it is in fact a paragraph element here. Okay, so those are the simple things that we can do with render arrays. Next thing we should look at is, why is this an array and not just a string or something simple? One of the most powerful things that a render array can do is be nested. So here's an example of a render array that contains other render arrays. And this is where we come back to this hash symbol that I talked about before. You can have whatever key you like in a render array, as long as it doesn't start with a hash symbol. If it starts with a hash symbol, it needs to be something that Drupal understands. But if it doesn't, that's an arbitrary label you can give a subarray that is another render array. This is powerful because it lets us structure our output in a way that's easy to reach in and make a change later. It also lets us mix and match all the different render array types that exist, element types. So in this example, there is a type called container, which basically makes a div. And we're saying that inside that element, we have this first element that can have whatever name we want to give it. And we're saying it's going to have an H1 called nested arrays. And then another array that I called content, but that's not a special name, that can contain stuff. Now here's this I'm demonstrating another capability here. This nested render array has no type, which means that it's just going to print out all of the nested render arrays. And because this array has no keys, it's just a standard PHP array, which means this is basically key 0, key 1. So I'm just demonstrating here that that the keys don't have to even be strings. They can be numbers, and that'll work just fine. So if we look at example 4, we see this outcome. We get the H1, we have a paragraph, we have another paragraph. And if I inspect that, we'll see that there is a div around the whole thing from the container. There's no container around these two child elements because we didn't give this sub array any type that would do that. But if I change this to have type container and refreshed this, now if we inspect this, oops, I have changed my caching settings, which we're going to talk about in a second. And that, so this now will show us that now we have that sub array, since it's a container, now gives us another div around those two elements that we didn't have before. So what that's demonstrating is that this is a hierarchical structure like the DOM is for HTML, but it isn't a one-to-one mapping. If we don't have something like type container, then there isn't necessarily the same nested structure in the resulting HTML as we see here. So this is a logical structure that it should make sense to our code, not necessarily exactly the same structure we're going to see on the page. All right, so those were the simple bones of a render array. Next, we're going to look at what else can be, like, why is this tag do something? Why is this value do something? What can we put in a render array? There are certain properties that are pretty much universally supported in every render array element and are good to know about to have in your toolbox. To start off with, there is one called attributes that is super handy. That lets you supply HTML attributes that that thing should have. And in that is an array of the names of the attributes and their values. If we look at this in the browser, we'll see that this H1, if I can make this bigger too. I can't, good. This H1 got an ID, it got a title, and it got a class based on this ID, title, and class. Generally speaking, you can put whatever key value you want in here and it will be reflected on the output on the page. I should call out here that class is special. As you can see, it is taking an array instead of taking a text string, which is unusual, but it's such a common thing to want to add classes later or remove classes that this is a way of making the list of classes be easy to manipulate until the last minute. If it were a string, you'd need to add a space and then add your new one, and you'd have to search through to see if it was already there first, and removing one becomes a hard search and replace. So since it's so common, class is an exception and expects an array of items, and you can see that it gets turned into a space separated list of classes before its output. In addition to attributes, another thing that is widely supported is the key wait. This is the Drupal concept of a wait for ordering. For people who are not familiar with that, Drupal has settled on the name wait for anything to do with ordering to make it consistent whether one is first because it's lowest, or if one is highest in a ranking of 1 to 10, or there are different ways you can conceptualize an ordering. So they decided to say that we're going to call this a wait so that we can say that heavier things sync. So the lightest one, the lowest one is always going to be on the top. And it's not necessarily an exact sequence. We could have this be 1.7 and this be 2000, and we would get the same result here. So what wait is doing is it's saying within this level of the render array, we're going to order these things so that the lightest one is first and then the heavier one. So despite the ordering here, we get this sequence that comes out the other side. So those you can expect to be able to use pretty much anywhere. Then we have attached, which is another very useful common to all render arrays value that you can use. It lets you in Drupal 8 and 9, the most useful thing that it lets you do, there are a few things you can attach, but the main thing you're going to be attaching is libraries. And those are the things that we're not going to talk about libraries in depth today, but basically there's a libraries YAML file in every module and theme that lets you define packages of JavaScript and CSS that are going to be tied in together, that have to do with one another. And you can refer to the library and make sure you get the CSS and corresponding JavaScript needed for any kind of user interface. So for this demonstration, I made a little CSS file here that looks for this class called attachment example and changes the background and the color. So that then gets referred to in our library file. So it's going to be called render demo /styling. It's the name I gave it. And if we look at example 6 again, we're going to attach render demo /styling and give it the class attachment example, which is the thing that we called it in our style sheet. And here we go. So this is a CSS that's not in our theme that is being injected as part of that render array. So a nice thing about this attachment mechanism is that you can do it right where the content is that needs to be styled that way or needs to have the JavaScript that affects it, rather than like knowing at the page level, hey, I need this style rule. So if this came from, say, a block and you don't know whether the block is on the page or not, the render system will take care of that for you. And if you have 3 different blocks that all ask for the same library, the render system knows, hey, I only need to include this one time. So that's a lot cleaner than having one place in your theme where you're going to have styles in JavaScript for everything on the site and try to deal with all that yourself. You can put the work where it belongs, next to the stuff that produced the content that you're trying to style or make interactive. Okay, so we're almost through these standard items. Here's a less used one, but an interesting one. There is a thing you can attach called a placeholder. And a placeholder looks for a particular key somewhere in the content of that element. So for example, in this value, we have a placeholder here inside this value. And that will be then replaced with a render array, again, at the last possible minute. So that lets you have something that might be expensive to compute, or the way you compute it might change based on another module or something like that, and not have to worry about it until the time comes. So this will show us the current time is, and then the current time, hopefully. Let's look. Great. And that is the current time in a different time zone than mine, as expected. Okay. Now, what might not be expected at first is that when I refresh this page, that time doesn't change. So that brings us to the next topic, which is caching. There are lots of different kinds of caching in Drupal. And this isn't a discussion about caching, but I just want to talk about how they impact render arrays. There is, first off, there is a page cache module, static page cache, that is an old relic of the past. It does a very simple job quite well, which is take the output of an entire page and put that entire thing in the database and feed that back out to the next person who goes to that URL. So that makes the second view of a page very fast. However, that, because of how simple that is, it can't understand when it shouldn't serve the same thing because something has changed. So, as a baseline rule, that module isn't the right approach for most sites, unless you know that the site is serving up exactly the same content to everyone, no matter what, and it's not time-based or anything. Instead, there is a module from Drupal 8 on called the dynamic page cache, which caches little chunks, and along with those little chunks, there's information that says this is applicable under the following circumstances, and these are the circumstances when you might need to rebuild it. So that ties in with the render system, because what we can do is add another property to a render array called cache, and we can supply that with information about when this render array, this chunk of this render array, is allowed to be cached under what circumstances. Again, it's a whole separate topic to talk through caching, but the things you might find there are tags, which are ways of telling Drupal the time, the different things that might cause this to need to be re-rendered and recached, and contexts, which are things that tell Drupal, hey, we need multiple versions of this cached at the same time, depending on something, like depending on the user's permissions, for example, or depending on a query string argument. So you'll see those most often. In this case, we're using a third, less used one, but it's appropriate since we're talking about something that changes every second. We're going to use max age to say that the longest this cache is allowed to live is 0 seconds. So with that in place, hopefully, we will see that every time I refresh this page, I get a different time. All right. So, yeah, go for it.
Clear, because it's just the browser caching just was something I was looking at the other day. So this is telling Drupal not to cache the output,
yes,
not having anything to do with the browser caching, correct?
That's correct. Yes. So the browser cache is handled a few different ways. Let's see if I can get a simple.
Yeah, I don't necessarily need to go into that. I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
this was not affecting the browser cache. This is just the Drupal cache.
But yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that same context you'll see is also used with respect to browser caching, the max age idea.
Right.
So it can get a little confusing, but in the response from the browser, there are some things that you can see. This does have a cache control of no cache. I'm curious, since we have a version here that does cache, whether this is giving different response headers or not. I don't actually know that. Yeah, okay. The current way that this server is set up is that it's sending a cache control of no cache. But that's a server level thing. So there are ways that you can convey for an individual page whether or not, like, what should be sent to the browser to tell it how long to cache. But generally that's a server level thing. You can see, however, in the headers that the dynamic cache reported a hit and that the max age was -1, as opposed to here that the max age is 0, and therefore the dynamic cache said this was uncacheable. So that bubbled up to the top level and is in the result that we see in the browser.
So that max age does that sets the cache to 0 regardless of if you have those modules in use. That's just Drupal core that says, hey, don't cache this.
That is related to the dynamic page cache.
Okay.
So that module would need to be on for that to be relevant. Otherwise, it's not caching anything.
Okay.
Drupal,
well, there's that Drupal site caching settings.
Yeah, and those come from, okay, if I log back in here.
Sorry, I don't mean to derail.
No, that's good. This is definitely a fruitful topic for a whole session, is just talking about all of the things that affect caching. If I, let's see, go to performance. Okay, so this is actually the setting that is setting max age for the browser. So we could crank this up and that would tell the browser to cache things. This doesn't have anything to do with the Drupal caching. This up here is talking about the Drupal caching. When you say clear all caches. So this is just metadata hinting to any browsers and proxies. This is how long I'd like you to hold on to this thing. And they should obey, but they're not required to. It's just information for them. Yeah. And since we're talking about it, I'll just pull up the list of modules so you can see. So there is internal page cache is the one that I don't recommend. That's the one that for anonymous users caches the entire page. And then the internal dynamic page cache is the one that is aware of contexts and tags and maximum age and those kinds of things. So that's the more powerful one, unless you have a site that really needs this level, in which case you might actually be in the place where you're going to be using something like a proxy anyway, a varnish or something like that. So
both of those are part of core.
Both of these two come with core. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So that is enough on caching for today, but again, we have enough that we can talk about that more, I'm sure, later. So let's talk a little bit about how you would know that this type HTML tag even exists in the first place. There are a few ways to do that. The basic idea, though, is we want to know every class that is extending this render element class. And that, fortunately, is done for us in the Drupal API documentation on this page called Form and Render Elements. It's linked to from the front of the API docs. And all this is doing is showing us in the core all of the classes that have that type. The reason I call out the classes is that this is limited to the core, and your contributed modules could be defining even more that you could use. So doing some searches through your code base can sometimes be a little bit nicer. So we can look at, so we've got our container here. We have things like pagers at the bottom of a paginated set of content. And on each of these, you'll see that they document what the properties are that it can take. And throughout the core, that's pretty well documented. So you can find a lot of things like that. Here's a really handy one. View. You might not know that this exists as a render element. The view render element lets you, let's see if I can find a quick example of that. If I look for type view, here's an example. You can have a render array with a type of view and then just give it the name of the view, and that will output that view. It can have which display do you want to use. This is saying use embed one. What arguments do you want to pass along? So that's a really handy thing to have in your toolbox because it's a very common need. You don't have to go through the dance that you did in Drupal 7 of loading in the view and processing it and everything. That all happens for you.
So that you could push a view into a controller readout
Yes.
or render.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yep. Right in the midst of everything else, you can just say, I want the content of this view. So you don't have to have a block region for it or anything like that.
And that arguments is the contextual filter. So you can,
Yes. Yep. And you can get it.
advantages, or one of the powers of doing this is that it obviously, because this is code, the ability to control the contextual filter is wide open beyond what the Views UI provides for you.
Yeah. So for example, there is a module I like quite a bit called entity view attachments that uses this mechanism to when an entity is being rendered, it changes the render array to add another item that is a view with the node ID of the current node you're looking at. So you can use that to have a contextual view. So for example, we just did a site that had a list of, well, had books and authors on it. And when you're on the authors page, I wanted to show all of the books that author had written. I could make a block with that view and get the argument, get the contextual filter using the URL, which would work, but then you have that block showing up in, like every time you render a page, it needs to figure out, do I display this block or not? Either that view is rendering and finding no results and not displaying, or you have to have rules that say whether or not to show the block, and those have to evaluate on every page. And with this mechanism, it's not even looking for it unless you're in the context of that node. So this is a nice clean way of doing things like that. So there are a lot, as you can see, a lot of things that are built in. Link is another one that is handy. A link takes a title and a URL object. The reason you would do this and not just have an A tag is that then it goes through all the normal processing. So it's going to do things like make sure it uses the right alias. If the alias gets updated, it'll understand that. It will. This is again a power of a render array. We had a need in a recent site, and we're going to be using this in future sites as well, to add a little icon whenever we had a link that went outside the website, one of those little boxes with an arrow going out of it that you've seen. And instead of finding all the places where that might happen, we could say whenever a link is being rendered like this, check to see if it's external and put that in place. So this now, doing it this way allows those kinds of hooks to all happen.
Oh, that's cool.
So that's another illustration of why we like doing render arrays as opposed to making markup, because the markup will be hard to modify later.
So if you're using the link like that, would you, if you say you got a block of text with a link in it and more text after it, are you using that link attribute, or are you using an HTML attribute with an A tag?
There are so there are two possibilities when you're saying block of text with a link in it. probably, if it's a block of text with a link in it, that is probably coming from user entered content. So it's probably a WYSIWYG field. So in that case, what you need to do is we wrote an input format filter so that that text gets processed and we can handle those. But most of the other links in Drupal are basically by themselves. They're things like in a menu, or they're usually not in the middle of a bunch of text. So that's where this kind of approach would come in handy.
Well, we wrote a module for address verification for students, but when I ported it over to 8, there's this huge block of verbiage, and then there's some links in there thrown throughout. And in order to get it to work, I had to do a markup, which I now know is bad. But,
yeah. So you can. One thing you could do would be to use the placeholder mechanism that we talked about, and have wherever the link would be, have a placeholder, and that placeholder can be a link render array.
Okay.
So it would then be processed before and go through that before it gets injected into the placeholder. And you'd be wanting to use a placeholder anyway because of translation. If you're writing a module, any text that comes out of the module, we've not been doing these for our examples to keep them simple, but they should be going through the string translation system anyway. Yeah. So that would also be a reason to do that. I was just going to show you here I need to find this. I shouldn't be doing this because I don't know where to look. Okay, here is an example of how we handle the external attributes in WYSIWYG contexts. Is we have a filter that does that processing.
I don't think I've ever written a filter.
And that'll be another full hour topic, but but here's the hook link alter. This is for all the things that are real links. So whenever you have a link in the context of a render array like that, it gets passed through any implementations of hook link alter. And we're just saying if that URL is external, then we're putting this text after it.
Okay.
John,
right. So that was
the note on that the page in the documentation that lists the possible elements. The web form module is a good example when that's enabled. There's a whole, it adds all its own custom render elements into the available ones that you can then use on a custom form. They wouldn't show up in that documentation, obviously.
Yeah, so one thing you can do if you've got a lot of modules installed is you can look for this extends render element. And we can see here are all these things in core, but also at the end, you might see here in contrib, you can see that here's an accordion render element that we defined, for example. And so this is horizontal tabs that was defined by field group, for example. So you can find other ones that way. Okay, so to wrap up here, since we're getting near the end of our time, just want to very quickly then go over what happens when a render array gets really complicated. You can see that these when we have them nested, like this is usable, but if it gets much more than this, it can be really hard to manage. So when things get very complicated, the best thing to do is to create a theme for it. So this is the fourth option. We talked about markup, plain text, and type. This is the fourth option, which is called theme, which is sort of the simplest possible case of a custom render element. We won't have time to talk about custom render elements today, but we can talk about theme because that will cover 90% of your cases anyway. When you define a theme, Drupal expects you to have a hook theme implementation, which needs to return an array of information, one of which is, here is the theme name. I'm going to go back and forth between these two. So here's the corresponding theme name. And then you define what are the possible hash somethings that we understand and can handle. So we are saying that I know about something called header, something called body, something called repeat, and something called fruit. Okay, so those are the four things that are allowed in these. And you'll notice I'm not providing all of them. I'm providing header, body, and repeat. But this is giving default values if not specified. So I'm handing this value along with the three that were indicated here along to that theme implementation. And where is that? Well, it's a template that has the same name with underscores changed to hyphens because that's how these work. It's a twig template. And in that twig template, you have access to those same values. So we're going to print out whatever was passed in with as header, which is going to be simple theme example. We're going to loop over repeat times, which is 4 times. And for each one, we're going to print out a paragraph, and we're going to substitute in this value, which is going to be from the default. And then we're going to print the body in a paragraph. And if we look at that, example 9, you can see the output of the template right here. So the reason you might do this again, instead of the deeply nested render array, is that, well, there are a few advantages here. One advantage is that the theme can now override this very simply just by in its templates having one with the same name. And it can rearrange things. It also, we can have some logic like this in the template where we do things multiple times or conditionally. We can put things in different orders and different nestings very easily. We could put the header inside the body paragraph or whatever we wanted to do, just by moving it around in easy to understand template. But we're not losing the capability to modify things later, because instead of a big string of HTML, we still have that array with these values in it. And those values can still be modified later on in the process by other modules. So it's kind of the best of both worlds there. Then the next step up from that is defining your own type, which lets you do more processing and logic. But we will have to put a pin in that and talk about that at a later time. So any other questions or comments?
I do have another question, but it doesn't revolve around this. It's something.
All right.
All
right. Well, I will stop.
If we have time for it.
Yeah, I will stop the recording then.
Okay.
And we will talk probably more about this or caching or something like that in a month.
Awesome.